In terms of cinema, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is undoubtedly a milestone. In terms of Walt Disney and his studio, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is the cornerstone, because everything that followed, all the cartoon features, the live action features, the theme parks, everything that Disney went on to do was built on this one film.
Happily ever after.
It's the ultimate adventure in film production at a time when to do an animated full-length film was absurd. This guy said, you know, we're gonna do this thing, we're gonna do it.
This was a very risky venture. If Snow White failed, the studio would have failed.
Everybody thought Disney was out of his mind for even attempting a feature-length animated film. The trades were calling it Disney's folly.
And he proved, despite the critics, that in fact it could be done.
How many people loved this film, saw this film around the world? It's an extraordinary story. Even just the story of the making of the film itself, it's an extraordinary venture. One of the great American success stories of all time.
When Snow White was released, people immediately realized the importance of the movie. That doesn't always happen with a film. Sometimes a film gains importance as time goes on. But the day after the premiere on December 21st, 1937, Walt was getting wires from various notables in the motion picture industry saying, this is one of the most important pictures ever made.
One of the critics who reviewed the film when it first opened compared it to D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. And I think today that may seem extraordinary, but that is exactly how important Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was.
Isn't it bright and shiny?
Oh, it's beautiful.
It changed everything, of course, for animation, but also in terms of live action, too. Opening up audiences for fantasy films, I think, you know, it's reverberated through the years.
But at the time, nobody believed that anybody ought to do a cartoon that would be a full-length thing. And I had many people tell me when I was working there that, who wants to see a full-length cartoon?
The very idea of sustaining an hour and a half with animation, how could that be done?
Because we were told by all the big movie moguls in Hollywood that it was okay 6, 7 minutes like the shorts, but an hour and a half, no way. Big reason was that you run out of funny things to do. So you had to have a laugh a minute. And the bright colors would hurt your eyes. Everybody get up and walk out.
What must Disney have thought? What must the people who work for him have thought when the trade papers were talking about this film as though it was born to be a disaster?
Don't be afraid. We're right behind you.
Yes, right behind you.
But Walt, of course, plugged ahead. He didn't believe that. He felt that if you had a solid story, not only laughs in it, but pathos and tragedy, it would go. And
I think Walt had this feature in the top of his mind, early on. I don't think he would ever have been satisfied to just make shorts. He also, I think, lived that story, Snow White, and it's more truly his than any of the features he did since.
Well, he always loved the story of Snow White, and he had seen a film production of it, a silent film, when he was a kid. And it was a very unusual screening. It was for the Newsboys of Kansas City. And they arranged it so that they would show the film simultaneously on 4 screens. So that alone would have, impressed in his mind, but the story also was of deep interest to him.
I think that the way that Walt grew towards Snow White was built into Walt from the very beginning. Walt was a storyteller, first and foremost. And when Walt first came to Hollywood, he wanted to be a director. He wanted to go into live action. And when that wasn't available to him, he went back into animation and started pushing that. So it naturally grew to where he felt he could take on this idea of telling a story.
Once there was a princess.
Was the princess you?
a long story that would involve real characters, real emotions, that would have funny situations, but would also have pathos.
Also, there were a lot of business incentives because Disney found that although he was producing these wonderful cartoons that were very, very popular, these films were costing more and more and returning less and less. So Disney made the decision, which had been made similarly by Charlie Chaplin and Laurel and Hardy, that if there was any future in the industry, it had to be by moving away from shorts to full-length feature animation.
Begin thy magic spell.
The first I heard about Snow White, it was almost a rumor. See, Walt brought new people into the studio who were good at drawing girls, and he was just building his staff. He was trying to organize things, and he didn't really tell anyone yet what he had in mind. Finally, it dawned on us that he's going to make a feature film. Then Walt called us all back one night, and he went through the whole story, telling everything, acting out all the parts the way he would do it. And we were sold. So I don't see how you'll ever finish it, but gee, it's sure a great idea. And then we all put our heart into it.
Just whistle while you work, and cheerfully together we can tidy up the place.
Very typical of Walt Disney. He kind of plucked a figure out of the air that would cost about $250,000, he thought. Very rapidly, they realized that that wasn't going to be sufficient, and it escalated to $400,000.
His brother Roy handled the finances and probably tore his hair out most of the time because Walt was always pushing for more and more perfection.
It wasn't about making money at that time. It was about being better, getting better, and being the best that they could be.
This is somebody who has a passion to do this as well as they can possibly do it.
Snow White is the most deliberated upon movie of all time. We're talking roughly 4.5 years of almost total devotion by Walt Disney. And the budget keeps on growing and growing and growing.
Now, there came a point when Disney's finances had all but run out. And Roy Disney said to his brother, "You've got to show the film to the bankers," which was the Bank of America. If you don't show them the film, they're not going to invest more money in it because they don't know what they're investing in.
Walt was a wonderful salesman and could sell anything. So they brought this executive in, and they showed him, which Walt hated, the pencil tests.
There were places where there wasn't any film. And so maybe there were still pictures put in of sketches. And then there was no soundtrack. So Walt would put in the lines, or he'd sing one of the songs, and he'd say, "This is where this happens, Joe, and then this happens." And this banker just sat there impassively watching and going, "Yes, yes, I see, yes."
The guy said nothing after the screening. They walked to the projection room, or walking him to his car. It must have been the longest walk in the world. And he got in his car and he said, "Oh, by the way, that thing's gonna make you a pile of money." Drove off and they got the check.
Only for you.
In Snow White, everything had to be tackled head-on first time round. And that's why it's amazing. Everything about the film was groundbreaking.
Jiminy Crickets.
The characters had to assume real personality in a way that they'd never had to do before.
What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?
Both vocally and visually, they had to live on the screen and make us care about them.
And please make Grumpy like me.
When Walt started Snow White, he had his core of animators who had animated the shorts. So there were a handful of superior animators. But Walt quickly realized he was going to need a whole core of new animators if he was going to get this through.
10 people were working in that studio in 1928 when Steamboat Willie was premiered. By the time Snow White was happening, people were saying, "We've got to have another 300 artists."
It was a kind of, a call to Mecca. Come to Mecca. We're doing great things here and we need you. And that period attracted, some of the most famous animators in the history of the Walt Disney Studio, all of whom came to work on Snow White in various capacities. So you had this tremendous infusion of talent that was just aching to do something and also learning how to do it on Snow White.
Well, the time was 1935. The Depression was on right down to the rock bottom. So a lot of us were out of school around this period of time. And the only person who was advertising for artists was Walt Disney.
You have to realize that what things were like in the Depression times. People were starving to death. And so it was a boon to be able to find a place where they would hire you and ask you to do your very best work, the very best that you could, and actually train you at the same time. And he was trying to teach us to be good enough artists to do what he wanted to do.
Well, I went there because there was a depression on at the time, which influenced the growth of the studio more than probably any other single factor.
You can say the times gave him more talent, but to me, the difference between Walt and some of the other cartoon producers was that Walt felt it so strongly inside. He wanted to do nothing but the very best that he knew he could inspire out of a great group of artists.
There was a tremendous pride in the place because of the fact that Walt was always trying to lift you up higher with all the classes and the films. He was always asking you to observe and study things, and there was constantly an effort to raise your standards, and you couldn't turn us off. We were excited about it.
But at the same time, you know, we didn't think the studio would last more than another week. It was exciting and it was fun. Sure had a great collection of artists and stimulating people around you. But you couldn't believe that anything like Snow White would go over with an audience.
Hello? May I come in?
You know, the stretch run of Snow White is really, really interesting because it is a stretch run. I mean, they're galloping full speed. Walt had not finally settled on even the names of the dwarves until less than a year before the release of the movie. So they're working full throttle trying to get this thing out in time for its December 21st release. They're worried that they're not going to do it. They're worried about what's going to happen if they don't do it.
A fine kettle of fish.
It's an incredible amount of work. I mean, most animated features on the average take about 4 years to make the movie, but at least nowadays we know that the rewards can be great. I think when they did Snow White, they really didn't know what the end result would be. The downside could have been the end of the studio. So while the future looked potentially bright, it also could be potentially tragic.
Don't worry. I'll be all right.
And indeed, the film gets completed literally, 2.5 weeks before its premiere. They didn't even have time to fully advertise the movie.
In fact, because we had no money to advertise the picture, we got these little placards about 1.5 feet high, and it was our job to go through Hollywood. All of us in the studio went out and tapped these on the telephone poles. It was the only way they knew about it. But of course, the premiere was sold out.
The premiere evening was very exciting. First Hollywood premiere I'd ever attended. It was at the wonderful old Carthay Circle Theater. We walked down this long double drive, and here were all the big searchlights and everything.
The part of the premiere that I remember the best was the end, after we got through it. The beginning, I was so nervous and uptight that I think I was nearly sick to my stomach, and I think most of us were.
It was, of course, the biggest event in my life. And there were cameramen lined up the whole distance. I was amazed.
And the thing that amazed me were the number of Hollywood stars there. I can remember sitting close to Lombard and Clark Gable and so forth, but at the climax of the film, everybody started crying. I couldn't believe it. Here was a cartoon, plain old crude cartoon, as the critics had said before we made it, and here was the audience crying en masse.
I remember that they laughed at the right places. They took it all just the way Walt wanted them to. It just was beautifully received.
They stood and they clapped and they clapped and they clapped. I tell you, I've never had goosebumps like that.
It was a great event. It was a big event in all of our lives.
Here were all these names on the screen and all these people, and they were great talents. And I mean really great talents. But, I'm sure of this, you could take all of us. Every one of the guys' names are on that screen, and everybody else had to do with the studio. And if there had never been a Walt Disney, all of these people lived, worked in the same place. There never would have been a Snow White.
I think Walt's genius was he was so ordinary in the sense that he knew what most people felt. He was the best audience himself. If he felt it, you could bet other people would feel it. But he was so uncommon in his reach for the dream that he had. And here's a guy that perhaps is one of the few people in this world that have been able through their lifetime to realize a continuous unfolding of their dreams.
Someday my prince will come.
The respect I have for that movie 70 years later is amazing, because I think that they put more work and effort into that film than many films that are made today, where it's become too easy to do the things that they couldn't do but had to find out a way to do it. So the film is important for many reasons, but as an adventure in filmmaking, I think it ranks up there amongst the best of them.
I don't know if a lot of people know this, it was such a big hit that it actually inspired MGM to give the go-ahead to The Wizard of Oz as a family film to try and compete with the success of Snow White.
And I certainly feel The Wizard of Oz borrowed from Snow White, and Star Wars borrowed from The Wizard of Oz, and they've built on the foundation these fantasy films that create a believable universe. The fantasy films that have worked have followed that same template that Walt did, where you create an imaginary world, but you make it believable. That kind of expressionistic filmmaking that Walt Disney and his fellow artists were doing really seeped out into the rest of the filmmaking world.
The way that Snow White inspired people, creative people in so many senses, it's incalculable how that film changed cinema, changed animation. If Snow White hadn't existed, we'd probably all be in a different place right now.